Oh
Whoa,
my
easy there. Hey,
God.
buddy.
A man named Robert stood outside the barn on a sunny afternoon in July. He was fixing the fence near the back area of Peterson Ranch. He was thinking about nothing special. He was just doing his work, hitting the metal posts with a hammer, when he heard something strange. It was a sound he had never heard before. It was the sound of a horse crying out, not in pain, but in something like fear and anger mixed together. Robert stopped what he was doing. He looked toward the back pastures, the place where nobody was supposed to be. He had worked at this ranch for 8 years and he knew the rules. The back pasture was for only one horse. That horse was Storm. Robert had heard the stories. Everyone who worked at the ranch knew them. Storm was the famous wild stallion that had thrown 50 men from his back. Some of the men were professional riders. Some were cowboys with 20 years of experience. Some were big, strong men who looked like they could lift a car with their bare hands. None of it mattered. Storm had thrown them all. But something was different about the sound Robert heard that day. It was not the sound of a horse celebrating a victory. It was a sound of confusion, like the horse was trying to understand something he did not understand. Robert put down his hammer and walked toward the back pasture. He walked slowly because he was not sure if he was allowed to go there. Peterson, the owner of the ranch, had told him many times to stay away from Storm. He said the horse was not dangerous if you left him alone, but that he was very dangerous if you got too close. Robert had always listened to that warning, but today, something made him curious. Today, Robert decided to walk anyway. When he got near the fence of the back pasture, he saw something that made his heart stop. There was a man he had never seen before. The man was standing in the middle of the field about 50 yards away from Storm. The man was wearing regular clothes. He was not wearing a hat. He was not wearing the heavy boots that cowboys wear. He was just standing there in simple clothes, looking at the horse. And Storm was doing something that Robert had never heard about in all the stories he had heard. Storm was standing very still, looking at the man and making sounds that Robert could not understand. The man did not move. He did not try to approach the horse. He did not have a rope or a saddle or any of the things that people normally use to control a horse. He just stood there. And then, something even stranger happened. Storm moved. The stallion walked toward the man. Robert's eyes went wide. He knew the stories. Everyone knew the stories. Storm did not let people get near him. Storm threw men off his back and sent them flying through the air. But here was this unknown man, and Storm was walking directly toward him. Robert wanted to call out. He wanted to warn the man. He wanted to tell him to run away because the horse was dangerous. But something in the way the man stood made Robert stay silent. The man did not look scared. The man did not look like someone who was about to make a terrible mistake. The man looked like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Storm got closer and closer. The stallion was now only 20 feet away from the man, then 10 feet, then 5 feet. Robert held his breath. This was the moment. This was when the man would die or get seriously hurt. This was the moment that Storm would attack, but Storm did not attack. Instead, the horse stopped moving. The stallion stood there, breathing heavily, his dark eyes looking directly into the eyes of the man. They stayed like that for a long time. Robert could not count how long. It might have been 30 seconds. It might have been 2 minutes. Time seemed to move differently when you were watching something impossible happen. Then the man did something very simple. He moved his hand slowly, very slowly. The movement was so slow that it looked like the hand was moving through thick honey. The man reached out and his hand touched the side of the horse's neck. Robert thought his heart would stop. This was it. This was the moment when the wild horse would bite the man or kick him or do something violent. But nothing happened. The horse accepted the touch. The horse allowed this stranger to put his hand on his neck. And then something even more surprising happened. Storm made a sound. It was not the angry sound that Robert had heard before. It was a quieter sound. It was the sound of a horse that was relaxing. It was the sound of a horse that had decided this person was not a threat. The man and the horse stayed together like that for several minutes. Robert stood frozen at the fence. He did not know what to do. He did not know what he was watching. All he knew was that something impossible was happening right in front of his eyes. The thing that everyone said could not be done, someone was doing it. The wild stallion that had thrown 50 men was standing peacefully while a stranger touched him. After a while, the man and the horse separated. The man stepped back slowly and Storm did not follow. The man walked toward the fence where Robert was standing. Robert thought about running away, but his legs would not move. The man got closer and Robert could see his face clearly. The man had gray eyes and a calm expression. He did not look like a famous horse trainer. He did not look like a cowboy star. He just looked like a normal older man who had done something that nobody else could do. The man saw Robert at the fence and he smiled a small smile. He did not say anything. He just walked past Robert and went back toward the barn. Robert turned to watch him go and then he turned back to look at Storm. The horse was still standing in the field, but he was different now. Something had changed in the way he stood. He looked less wild. He looked less angry. He looked almost like he was waiting for something.
Storm did not move. The horse did not buck. The horse did not try to escape. Storm simply felt the weight of the man, and the horse understood that this weight was not painful. This weight was not cruel. This weight was simply a man who had learned to be with a horse instead of controlling a horse. Minutes passed. Robert was crying now. Pete was crying. Many of the people watching were crying, and they did not fully understand why. They were crying because they were witnessing something that challenged everything they had always believed. They were witnessing a wild animal choosing trust over fear. They were witnessing gentleness being more powerful than force. When Thomas finally stepped back and removed his weight from the saddle, he removed the saddle itself and set it on the ground. He did not try to ride Storm. He did not push the moment further. The lesson had been taught. The trust had been proven. The wild stallion had allowed a man to put his weight on his back, and the horse had remained calm and safe. As the sun went down that evening, Thomas walked beside Storm in the pasture, and the horse walked beside the man. There was no rope. There was no control. There was only two beings who had learned to be together without fear. The story of the horse that broke 50 cowboys was not ending with another man being thrown. The story was ending with something far more beautiful. It was ending with an animal learning that the world could be safe. It was ending with a human learning that love was more powerful than conquest. It was ending with everyone who watched understanding that sometimes the greatest victories come not from winning, but from finally learning how to let go of the need to win. As night fell over Peterson Ranch, Storm grazed peacefully in the back pasture, and Thomas slept beside him. And nobody who had witnessed that day would ever see horses or people or the possibility of trust between them in exactly the same way again. The wild stallion had changed them all, and in changing them, the wild stallion had finally been free. The morning of the ride came on a day when everything seemed to stop and hold its breath. It was a Saturday in September, and the weather was perfect. The sky was blue. The sun was warm, but not too hot. The wind was gentle. Thomas woke up in his camp, and Storm was standing beside him as usual. But something was different. Thomas could feel it. Storm could feel it. The whole world could feel it. Today was the day. Thomas did not have a plan. He had never planned this moment. He did not know if it would happen today, or next week, or next month. But as he stood up and looked at the horse, he understood that Storm was ready. The horse's eyes were calm and clear. The horse was not afraid. The horse was waiting for what came next. Pete was already awake and watching from the barn. He had woken up early because he could not sleep. He had felt something in the air, something that said something important was going to happen. Other ranch workers began arriving, not because they were called, but because they knew. Word had spread through the community. Everyone wanted to see if it was true. Everyone wanted to see if the wild stallion would finally accept a rider. By mid-morning, about 20 people had gathered at the fence of the back pasture. They stood silently, watching. Some of them had brought their children to witness this moment. Some of them had brought cameras, but Thomas had asked them not to take pictures. He said this moment was not for cameras. This moment was for the horse and the man and everyone who had learned something by watching. Thomas brought a saddle. It was a simple saddle, not fancy or complicated. He had been leaving it in the pasture for weeks, and Storm knew what it was. He had smelled it many times. Thomas placed the saddle on the ground and walked away. Storm looked at it. The horse sniffed it. Then Storm did something nobody expected. The horse walked over the saddle, stepped right over it, and continued grazing. It was like the horse was saying, "I know what this is, and it does not scare me." An hour passed. 2 hours. Thomas did nothing. He simply sat with his back against the fence, and Storm grazed nearby. The people watching began to wonder if anything would happen today. Some of them checked their watches. Some of them became impatient. But Thomas was not impatient. Thomas was simply waiting for the right moment. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Thomas stood up very slowly. He walked to where the saddle was lying on the ground. He picked it up and held it against his body. Storm looked at Thomas. The horse watched carefully as Thomas approached. Thomas moved very slowly, like he was moving through a dream. He came near to Storm's side. Storm stood perfectly still. Gently, very gently, Thomas placed the saddle on the horse's back. Storm did not move. The horse did not buck or run. Storm simply accepted the weight and the presence of the saddle. Thomas fastened the cinch under the horse's belly, and Storm breathed calmly. Nothing bad happened. Storm did not panic. Storm did not try to hurt anyone. The wild stallion who had thrown 50 cowboys simply stood there while a man put a saddle on his back. It was quiet and peaceful and absolutely miraculous. The people watching began to understand something. They began to understand that breaking a horse and gentling a horse were two completely different things. They began to understand that Storm was not broken. Storm was not conquered. Storm was choosing this. Storm was allowing this because he trusted the man beside him. Thomas stood back and looked at what he had done. The saddle was on the horse. Everything was ready. But Thomas did not mount. Thomas did not try to ride yet. Instead, Thomas walked around Storm several times, letting the horse get used to the weight and the feeling. Thomas talked quietly, not with many words, but with a calm voice that said, "You are safe. You are okay. You are brave." Then Thomas did something that made everyone gasp. He took the saddle off. He removed it slowly and carefully, and he set it on the ground. Storm watched as the saddle came off, and the horse seemed almost curious about what would happen next. Thomas walked away and sat down against the fence again. He wanted Storm to know that the saddle was not permanent. He wanted the horse to understand that this was not about being controlled. This was about being trusted with a choice. For 2 more hours, Thomas repeated this. He would approach Storm. He would put the saddle on very gently. He would let the horse stand with it for a few minutes. Then he would remove it. He did this over and over. Each time, Storm was calmer. Each time, the horse seemed more comfortable. Each time, a little more fear was replaced by a little more understanding. As the sun was beginning to go down, creating long shadows across the field, Thomas stood beside Storm one more time. This time, he put the saddle on, and he did not remove it immediately. Instead, Thomas walked to a fence post and stood there, giving the horse time to understand that the saddle would stay. Storm shifted his weight a few times, getting used to the feeling. The horse did not panic. The horse breathed calmly and waited. Then Thomas did something that nobody could have predicted. He walked to Storm's side, and instead of mounting from above like a normal rider would do, Thomas stood beside the horse and simply leaned his body gently onto the saddle. He did not swing his leg over. He did not jump on. He simply pressed his weight against the saddle so Storm could feel what it was like to have a human on his back. Days passed, and Thomas became part of the ranch. He was always in the back pasture. He was always near Storm. But he was doing something very strange. He was doing almost nothing. Every morning, Thomas would wake up in his sleeping bag and move it to a different spot in the field. He would move it closer to where Storm usually stood, but only by a few feet each day. He did not talk to the horse. He did not try to touch the horse. He simply existed in the same space as Storm, and he did his work quietly. Thomas spent his days reading books and writing in his notebook. Sometimes he would sit with his back against the fence post and sleep for hours. Sometimes he would walk slowly through the field, just walking and looking at the grass and the sky. Pete and the other ranch workers did not understand what Thomas was doing. Robert asked Pete one day if Thomas was training the horse. Pete said he did not think so. Pete said Thomas was doing something else. Pete said Thomas was teaching the horse that humans could be boring and safe at the same time. By the second week, something small happened that made everyone pay attention. Storm came closer. The horse was grazing, doing his normal things, when he suddenly started moving toward where Thomas was sitting. Thomas did not move. Thomas did not look up from his book. Storm got closer and closer. He walked right past Thomas, only 10 feet away, and continued walking. but it was the closest Storm had ever come to a human without trying to hurt them. The ranch workers watched from a distance, and they whispered to each other. Something was happening. Something was changing. But then something bad happened. On the 15th day, Thomas made a mistake. He got excited. He had been sitting quietly as usual when Storm came very close, and Thomas thought this was the moment. Thomas thought this was when the horse would finally let him touch him. Thomas reached out his hand very slowly. He tried to be gentle, but Storm saw the hand coming toward him, and something in the horse's mind said danger. Storm reared up on his back legs. His front hooves went high into the air. Thomas jumped back, and Storm came down hard on the ground. The horse ran away to the far corner of the field, and for the first time, Storm looked at Thomas with something that looked like anger. Thomas sat on the ground where he had fallen. He was not hurt, but he was sad. He had lost something. The trust that had been slowly building was broken. Pete came running out from the barn, asking if Thomas was okay. Thomas said he was fine. He said the problem was him, not the horse. He said he had tried to take something before the horse was ready to give it. He said he had let his excitement get in the way of his patience. Thomas stood up and walked back toward his camp. He did not look toward Storm. He did not try to see the horse. He just walked and sat down and opened his book like nothing had happened. The next 2 days were the hardest days. Storm stayed far away from Thomas. The horse would not come close. The horse did not seem to want to be near this human who had broken the peace. The ranch workers thought it was over. They thought Thomas had failed. They thought the horse would never trust him now. Robert heard them talking in the barn. He heard them say that Thomas was wasting his time. He heard them say that some horses could not be reached. But Robert did not say anything. Robert was watching Thomas, and he saw something the others did not see. What Robert saw was that Thomas did not give up. Thomas did not get angry. Thomas did not try to force anything. Instead, Thomas went back to the beginning. He moved his camp further away from Storm. He went back to doing almost nothing. He went back to just existing quietly in the field. And he waited. He waited while the sun was hot. He waited while the rain came and soaked his sleeping bag. He waited while the other workers doubted him. By the 21st day, something changed again. But this time, it was different. This time, Storm approached Thomas not quickly but slowly. The horse walked across the field, and his movement was calm. His ears were forward, which meant he was interested, not afraid. Storm got close to where Thomas was sitting against the fence post. The horse was breathing, and his breath made a soft sound. Thomas stayed perfectly still. His heart was beating very fast, but his body did not move. Storm stood there for a full minute. Then the horse lowered his head and smelled Thomas's shoulder. It was not a touch. It was not a hand on the horse's neck. But it was something. It was the horse choosing to get close to the human. It was the horse choosing to investigate with his own senses. When this moment happened, Pete was watching from the barn. Pete had tears in his eyes. He did not understand why he was crying. He just knew that something pure and true was happening right in front of him. He knew that his horse was learning that humans could be different from what he thought they were. He knew that Thomas was teaching Storm something that nobody else had been able to teach this wild animal. That night, Thomas sat at the dinner table with Pete, and Pete asked him how he had learned to do this work. Thomas said he had not learned it from a book or a school. He said he had learned it from horses. He said that every horse had taught him something. He said that Ruby, the horse in Colorado, had taught him about patience. She had taught him that sometimes you have to wait longer than you think is possible. He said that a horse in Montana had taught him about respect. That horse had taught him that animals know when you are being real and when you are being fake. He said that Storm was teaching him something new. He said Storm was teaching him about the power of gentleness. Pete asked if Thomas thought Storm would ever accept a rider. Thomas said he did not know. Thomas said that maybe the point was not whether Storm would accept a rider. Thomas said that maybe the point was just that Storm would know that at least one human in the world understood him. At least one human had taken the time to learn his language. At least one human had shown him that not all humans wanted to control him. The next morning, when Robert came out to work, he saw something that made him smile. Thomas was still asleep in his camp, but Storm was standing very close to him. The horse was not moving. Storm was just standing there, keeping watch over this sleeping man. The wild stallion, the horse that had thrown 50 cowboys, was protecting a human. Robert understood then that Thomas had not come to break the horse. Thomas had come to show the horse that love was real. Love from a human could be real. And now Storm was returning that love in the only way a horse could return love. Storm was offering his protection. Storm was offering his trust. Storm was offering the most valuable thing a wild horse could offer. He was offering himself. He said, "No, Pete, I am not going to break your horse. Horses that are broken stay broken. They get a sadness in them that never goes away. I am going to try something different. I am going to try to let your horse know that there are humans in the world who do not need to own him. There are humans who just want to be near him." Pete did not know what to say. He had been expecting a man with special equipment or a plan or some technique. Instead, he had gotten a man with only an idea. Thomas turned to Pete and asked if he could camp out in the back pasture for a few days. He asked if he could sleep on the ground near where Storm lived. Pete said yes, but he warned Thomas again that the horse was dangerous. Thomas said, "Yes, he is. But so am I in my own way. Every living thing is dangerous. The question is not whether something is dangerous. The question is what you do with that danger." That first night, Thomas made a simple camp in the back pasture. He brought a sleeping bag and a thermos of water and a notebook where he liked to write his thoughts. He did not bring food to give to the horse. He did not bring a saddle or a rope or anything that looked like it was meant to control an animal. He just brought himself. When the sun went down, the stars came out, and the whole world seemed to be holding its breath. Thomas lay in his sleeping bag, and Storm stood about 100 yards away, also awake, also watching. All night long, they watched each other. Neither one of them slept much, but something was happening between them, something that could not be explained with words. The next morning, when the sun came up, Robert was walking through the ranch doing his morning work. He went out toward the back pasture to check on things. What he saw made him stop walking. There was a man and a horse, just standing together. The man was not holding the horse. The horse was not moving away. They were just standing together in the early morning light, and there was something beautiful about it. Robert did not know what he was watching, but he knew it was important. He knew that something that no one else had been able to do, this man was doing. And he was doing it not with force, but with patience. Not with control, but with something that looked a lot like love. By the time Pete woke up and came out to check on Thomas, word had already spread through the ranch. The men who worked there had heard that the stranger was doing something with Storm. They were curious and confused. Some thought he was crazy. Some thought he had a secret trick. But as they watched from a distance, they began to understand. There was no trick. There was only a man and a horse, finding a way to be together that did not require pain or fear or force. There was only the simple, powerful act of one being choosing to trust another being. And that was more powerful than any trick in the world. That night, Robert asked Pete Peterson who the man was. Pete said his name was Thomas Mitchell, and he had come to the ranch to spend time with Storm. Robert asked what that meant. Pete said it meant different things to different people, but what it really meant was that Thomas was going to try something that nobody else had ever tried. He was going to try not to break the horse. He was going to try to understand him instead. Robert did not understand what that meant. He had lived his whole life around horses that were broken and trained and used for work. He had never heard of a person trying to simply understand a horse. But as Robert went to sleep that night, he thought about the moment when Storm's neck felt the man's hand. He thought about the quiet sound the horse had made. He thought about the way the wild stallion had looked at the stranger. And for the first time in his life, Robert wondered if there was another way to be with horses. A way that was not about control. A way that was not about winning. A way that was about something else entirely. Something he could not quite name, but something that had changed the way he saw Storm forever. Thomas Mitchell drove his truck slowly down the long dirt road toward Peterson Ranch on a Tuesday morning in early July. The sun was already hot, and dust was rising behind his truck in a long cloud that looked like a ghost following him. Thomas was 53 years old, but his face looked older. His skin was tan and lined from spending most of his life outside. His hands, resting on the steering wheel, were rough and scarred from work. But his eyes were different. His eyes were young and kind and full of something that looked like hope. Thomas had been driving for 6 hours to get to this ranch. He had come from another ranch in Colorado where he had been working with a horse named Ruby. Ruby was a mare that had been beaten by her previous owner. She did not trust humans. She was always angry. But Thomas had spent 3 months with Ruby, and by the time he left, the horse would eat sugar from the palm of his hand and follow him around like a puppy. Pete Peterson had called Thomas 2 weeks before. Pete had said that he had a horse that needed help. Pete had said that this was not like other horses. This horse had a reputation. This horse had thrown 50 different men. But Pete did not call to ask Thomas to break the horse. Pete called because he had read an article about Thomas in a magazine. The article was about a man who did not break horses. The article said that Thomas worked with horses in a different way. The article said that Thomas listened to horses instead of controlling them. Pete had felt something when he read those words. He had felt like maybe there was someone in the world who could understand his horse. Someone who would not try to force Storm into something Storm did not want to be. When Thomas pulled up to the ranch, Pete was waiting for him. Pete was 67 years old. His face was weathered like leather, and his body was bent slightly from decades of physical work. But his eyes were warm and full of life. Pete and Thomas shook hands, and Pete could immediately tell that this was a genuine person. Thomas was not acting. He was not putting on a show. He was simply a man who cared about horses. Pete showed Thomas where he would be staying, in a small house near the barn. It was simple and clean and quiet. Thomas put his few things inside, and then he asked Pete if he could see the horse. They drove out in Pete's truck to the back pasture. Pete explained as they drove. He told Thomas the story of Storm. He told him about the first man who tried to ride the Stallion. He told him about the 50 men who had come after that, each one thinking they would be different, each one thinking they would be the one to break this wild horse. He told him how the stories had grown bigger and bigger over the years. Some people said Storm had killed a man. Some people said the horse had no heart, that he was pure evil. But Pete said none of that was true. Pete said that Storm was just a horse who knew what he wanted, and what he wanted was to be free. Thomas listened to all of this without saying much. He just nodded and looked out the window at the landscape. When they arrived at the back pasture, Pete pointed to where Storm usually stood. But Storm was not there. Pete said they would have to wait. He said the horse liked to spend the early morning in the far part of the field, near the trees. So Pete and Thomas sat in the truck, waiting. After about an hour, they saw movement. A dark shape came from behind the trees. It was Storm. Even from a distance, you could feel the power of the horse. You could feel the wildness. This was not a tame animal. This was something raw and strong and untamed. Thomas got out of the truck and walked to the fence. Pete called out, asking what he was doing. Thomas said he wanted to get a closer look. Pete warned him that the horse was unpredictable. Thomas did not answer. He just stood at the fence and looked at Storm. The horse had stopped moving when he saw Thomas. Storm was now standing perfectly still, about 300 feet away, looking directly at this new person. Thomas did not move either. They just looked at each other across the distance. For the first time, Thomas spoke about what he was thinking. He said, "That horse is not wild because he is mean. That horse is wild because he has not met anyone worth trusting yet." Pete did not understand what Thomas meant. Pete asked if Thomas meant he was going to try to break the horse. Thomas laughed, but it was not a mean laugh. It was a kind laugh.